I am a single father to my daughter Lily. After the divorce, I no longer wanted to live in the same town as my ex, so I purchased a farmhouse and decided to make a living there. It was a decent neighborhood, not much noise and interference from the neighbors. Actually, we barely knew one another, but I liked it that way. It had been a week precisely since we had moved there, and everything seemed to be fine, besides one specific night. Lily woke me up from a deep sleep, saying she heard people's voices coming from outside. It was during the month of July, so all the windows were open to get some fresh air in the house. I got out of bed and looked around, but I couldn't see or hear anything, so I thought she was probably dreaming. Despite trying really hard, neither Lily nor I were able to sleep after that, and I laid in bed wide awake. Shortly after, I was able to hear the same exact noises Lily was describing earlier. There were faint muffled voices coming from outside. I immediately stood up and investigated, but I couldn't see anything. To protect my daughter, property, and livestock, I keep an assault rifle in my room in the case of an emergency, so I decided to go outside and investigate. It didn't take long until I noticed a hooded figure wearing a black cloak looking into my chicken coop. I raised my gun and aimed it at him, then screamed, "Don't move." Now being up close, I could make out that it was a middle-aged male who was definitely startled by my presence. He raised his hands up and took a few steps backward, and I told him again to not move. I asked him what he was doing on my property, and he couldn't give any response, mumbling out a few unintelligible words, then saying, "I'll leave now." I told him to get moving, and escorted him off my property, still pointing my gun at him. Once he was off, I made it clear that I will shoot him if he ever comes back, and he nodded his head as he turned to walk down the street. The entire encounter was really odd, and the more I thought about it, the more concerned I became. It definitely looked like he was going to steal my chickens, and just to be sure, I went back over and counted them just to make sure he didn't take any of them at some point. They were all accounted for, so I turned to head back inside, until I heard the sounds of footsteps rustling around my cornfield. I raised my rifle in the air and let off a few rounds, then screamed, "Whoever's in there, come out now, or I'm going to start shooting in there." Suddenly, the sound of multiple footsteps approached, and I watched as 3 more people wearing the same hooded cloaks emerged out of the cornfield. Like the first guy, they raised their hands in the air and stood there staring at me. 2 of them were women, and the other one was a man, maybe 20 years older than the first man I found. I asked them what the hell they were doing, but before I could get a response, I heard even more footsteps moving around the cornfield. I had no idea what was going on, and I quickly grew worried as I thought about the safety of my daughter. I turned and ran back inside, locked and shut all the doors and windows, then called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes, and officers searched my entire property, but everyone was gone. However, they did discover something very disturbing. Almost dead center in the middle of the cornfield, there was a circle made of red paint, with a box of matches and a red polyethylene container of gasoline. Ever since that night, I've installed security cameras all throughout my property. It definitely seemed to be some sort of cult ritual setup, and the whole thing still really freaks me out. I'm not sure if I'll ever tell Lily, maybe when she's older, but for now, all I'm focused on is keeping her safe. I've been writing horror stories and producing them for the past 10 years. It's always been a fun little side gig, since it's something I'm very passionate about. Although I'm by no means a big-time movie producer, I try to go beyond just writing and producing. First of all, I make movies based on real-life incidents, and I'll also spend a few days at the actual site to get a full familiarity of the situation. Once I get the feel for the area, I'll then move on to writing and producing, which is probably why I've only produced about 7 films in the span of 10 years. What happened left me confused, scared, and honestly full of disbelief. I was at my study reading a news article about a haunted farmhouse near Imber Village, UK. I was living in Poland at the time, having grown up there with my mom. When I read through the article, it seemed like the place would be a great setting for a movie, so I decided to check it out. I quickly collected all the pertinent details surrounding the story, and within a week, I arrived at the site with Anthony, who is now my husband. The property was available upon rent, so we booked it for a few nights, since it was also really cheap. The news articles about the farm explained that all 9 of the house's owners had moved out within the first 6 months after living there, who all made the same claim that it was haunted with spirits. Looking deeper into the story, The original family who lived there in 1939 all died gruesome deaths from an unknown person or persons. Several people who had been there to investigate since had also reported seeing and hearing strange things, so I wanted to see what it was all about. To be honest, although I'm a horror story writer and producer, I'm also a skeptic. Frankly, I've never believed in ghosts, and I usually don't get scared or believe in what others say unless I experience it myself. We eventually reached the property after making it to the airport and renting a car, packing lightly with our basic essentials. After parking our car in the long dirt driveway in front of the house, we got out and immediately headed to the barn, which supposedly was the haunted site. The barn was huge, but it was run down, desperately needing a makeover. The untrimmed weeds and bushes around the barn definitely gave it an overall creepy outlook. After exploring the barn for a little while, we eventually went back to the car, grabbed our suitcases, and headed inside. The inside of the house had definitely been renovated, and it actually looked way less creepy than the barn. As time passed by, the sun eventually set, and Anthony and I were in the dining room eating dinner. We eventually turned in and fell asleep a couple hours later, only to be awakened by a sound coming from outside. Our bedroom was on the second floor, so we got up and peered out the window, not being able to see anything. As soon as Anthony opened up the window, we were able to hear the sound much more clearly. Someone was whistling outside, and it sounded close. I slammed the window shut, grabbed my video camera, and started recording. I filmed it almost like a vlog, but I decided that if we actually encountered something, it could be added into a scene of the movie. I crept down the stairs with Anthony, explaining to the camera that we were just awakened to someone whistling on the property, with full intentions of heading to the barn to see what we could find. I quietly opened the back door to the farmhouse and walked out, noticing that the whistling had stopped. I was leading the way in front of Anthony, who was quite scared, but I was surprisingly more excited than anything. I opened the barn doors and shined my flashlight along the inside, hoping to catch something. However, after waiting at least 5 minutes, we didn't see or hear anything, so we started walking back to the farmhouse. Suddenly, me and Anthony froze in our steps as we watched the light to our bedroom flip on and off. Up until that point, I really wasn't that scared, but now actually seeing that someone or something was in our bedroom, I was freaked out. Anthony suggested sneaking into the house and grabbing the keys which were in the kitchen, and since we didn't really have other options, I agreed. The nearest house wasn't even close, and both of our phones were in the bedroom upstairs. As quietly as possible, we entered through the side door, the same door that was unlocked after we exited through it. Tiptoeing across the room, Anthony grabbed the keys and bolted towards the door. I didn't hesitate and followed right behind him. As we were walking to the car, Anthony's face turned pale. I tried asking him what was wrong, but he only replied saying, "Just keep walking. I'll tell you when we get in the car." As soon as we got in, Anthony pointed to a figure walking towards the barn from the field, and I was in total disbelief. We watched as the person looped around to the back of the farmhouse, then disappeared behind it. Anthony threw the car in reverse and we sped away, desperately searching for an open business to use a phone to call for help. We eventually found a 24-hour diner and notified the authorities of the 2 people who seemingly walked into our house. They eventually made it over to the property and searched the entire place, but it was found completely empty, with no trace of anyone or anything being there. We eventually drove back and met with the authorities, then packed up all our belongings from the house and left. We stayed in a hostel until we could book a flight home, and we both went home completely shaken. I have no explanation as to what happened that night, nor do I know who those people were or what they were doing there, but it was almost like we were lured out. I grew up with my parents in the city, but I was really close to my grandparents in Kentucky. I used to visit them all the time as a little kid, and I had so many memories there with my cousins. Every summer vacation, my cousins and I would make a trip out there and stay for a couple weeks at our grandparents' house in the countryside at their farm. They spoiled us to every extent. We could stay up late at night, eat food in our bedrooms, wake up late, and do just about everything a little kid wants to do when they're generally not allowed. However, our favorite part was that we could play hide and seek in their enormous cornfields in between a vast jungle. There was just so much peace and tranquility there, which is probably the reason why my grandparents liked living there all by themselves. It was the month of June in 2011. It was the day that my cousins Morgan, Lucy, and I had arrived. We were all about 12 to 13 years old. After having our supper around 4 p.m., we all decided to play hide and seek in the field. The weather was just right too, and the corn stalks were also big enough to make a proper hideout. Lucy tied a blindfold around my eyes and asked me to count to 10, where she'd say something like, "Come and find us. I'll yell hot if you come close." After counting to 10, I wandered around the field searching for my cousins. As I began to move about, I heard something moving around to my side, so I started walking in that direction. I continued hearing the noises, so I yelled, "I got you," but no one said anything back. I assumed it was probably Lucy messing with me, because she was indeed the silliest one among us and always did stuff like that. I eventually stopped hearing whatever I was following, so I kept wandering around waiting for someone to yell hot. Suddenly, I heard footsteps just feet away from me. Assuming it must be Lucy or Morgan, I yelled, "I got you," and then began to take off my blindfold. Strangely, it wasn't either of them. In fact, there was no one in front of me. I was all alone in the middle of the field. The sun had already set, and it was noticeably darker now. I moved farther, screaming out my cousins' names, but none of them answered. But how would they? I was so deep inside the cornfield to the point that I was lost. For a 12-year-old, my height wasn't that tall, and I could no longer see my grandparents' house. I relentlessly ran around terrified, not knowing the direction I was heading. Unexpectedly, I heard something move nearby. I stood still trying to analyze who it was. Gradually, the footsteps became more clear. Then, all at once, I felt cold hands covering my eyes. I was horrified and in a complete state of panic. My throat tightened as I promptly shook the hands away from me and turned around. Behind me was a tall and lean man standing firmly about a few inches away from my face. He was wearing a black-colored jacket, and he kneeled down to look at me. My stomach clenched. The man looked dreadful. There were multiple scars across his face, a deep blue wound on his cheek, and a trail of dirt that ran down his face, almost like it was smeared on. "Who are you?" I trembled as I spoke. The man didn't speak, but he slowly stretched his mouth to smile. Not the kind of smile that you make when you feel happy, but rather startling. As he smiled, that was when I realized that he was the one I found earlier. My voice was shrill with terror, yet I screamed as loud as I could and ran wherever my legs took me. But before I was able to make an escape, he grabbed my hand and dragged me down to the ground. I tore at my knees and hit my elbow, and I still have the scars to this day. As I tried to stand up, he reached his hand forward. With long nails and black stuff underneath them, he was oddly moving his arms in a slow manner, so I took my only chance and pushed him aside as I tried to flee once again. After that, I ran as fast as I could. I was incredibly lucky that night because I was able to find my way back home. My heart was racing a million miles per hour as I approached the house, seeing my grandparents and cousins looking for me. I lost words and couldn't stop crying, but I was able to tell my grandparents that there was a man in the cornfields. In a matter of time, I collected myself and began to share everything that had happened. My grandpa wasted no time and grabbed a shotgun and made his way out into the fields. Looking back now, I'm not sure why they didn't call the police right away, but my grandparents, especially my grandpa, were very old school. As we sat around inside waiting for my grandpa to return, the loud crack of gunshots echoed in the field, shortly followed by my grandpa walking back inside, who calmly said, "I got him. Call the police." My cousins and I were all sent to my uncle's house about a half hour away, and neither of us slept a wink that night. It turns out, that man was a registered sex offender who lived just down the road from my grandparents. He had already served time for his crimes, but my grandpa recognized him and knew exactly who he was. As to how that man knew we were staying there, I still don't know to this day. He most likely had to have seen us outside earlier that day at some point, because I don't know why else he'd be snooping around my grandparents' property. Unfortunately, my grandpa passed away in 2017, but my grandma still owns the property to this day. Nonetheless, my grandpa was a hero, and I still miss him every day.